History books have lied to you for nearly 200 years. William Henry Harrison did not die from the cold. He died from contaminated water. In 1841, the White House had no filtration system. The president's drinking water was piped directly from a natural spring located right below the Capitol's massive human waste depot. Every single day, he unknowingly drank typhoid bacteria. That was the real assassin. It ended his presidency in exactly 31 days, delivered straight from the glass of water on his desk. The 1840 campaign painted Harrison as a rugged frontiersman born in a log cabin, sustained by cheap hard cider. The reality was a carefully constructed fabrication. Born into the staggering wealth of Virginia's Berkeley plantation, Harrison was groomed for absolute power, surrounded by vast estates and the highest echelons of the colonial elite. His early education was classical, refined, and completely disconnected from the frontier struggles he would later claim to champion. He studied the classics, Latin, and history. At the age of 14, he was sent to Hampton Sydney College. Following the rigid expectations of his aristocratic class, his father steered him towards a highly respectable profession. He was to become a physician. In 1790, young Harrison was dispatched to the prestigious University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He was placed directly under the tutelage of Dr. Benjamin Rush. This is a deeply critical moment in understanding his eventual fate. Benjamin Rush was the most famous physician in America, a founding father himself, but his medical philosophy was profoundly brutal. It was the absolute peak of heroic medicine. Rush believed passionately in purging the body of disease through massive bloodletting, forced vomiting, and violently aggressive bowel evacuations. He believed that the sicker the patient, the more aggressively they must be drained of their bodily fluids. Young Harrison was forced to witness this savagery every single day. He watched patients writhe in agony under the physician's knife and the burning blister plasters. He saw people drained of their blood until they fainted in the name of healing. Harrison hated it. He detested the sight of blood. He could not stomach the screams of the sick, nor the horrific invasive treatments passed off as modern cures. He realized with a deep sense of dread that he had no heart for the medical arts. He quietly, without fanfare, dropped out of the program. It is a terrifying, almost unbelievable irony that the very medical system he fled from in terror as a young man would, exactly 50 years later, return to torture him to death inside the walls of the White House. When his father suddenly died in 1791, the vast family fortune was largely tied up in land and older siblings. Harrison found himself surprisingly low on liquid funds. Up to this point, everything is still relatively normal for a second-tier aristocratic son trying to find his way in the world. He needed a new path. He needed a career that did not involve leeches, scalpels, or the agonizing cries of dying patients. He chose the military. He was immediately ordered west, plunged deep into the Northwest Territory, to a bleak outpost called Fort Washington, located near present-day Cincinnati. This was the real, unvarnished frontier. It was not a colorful political campaign slogan. It was a brutal, unforgiving, and highly lethal war zone. The newly formed United States government was locked in a vicious existential conflict with a powerful confederacy of Native American tribes who were rightfully defending their ancestral lands. When Harrison arrived at the fort, the American army was in absolute tatters. They had just suffered a catastrophic, humiliating defeat. Morale was non-existent. Disease was rampant. This horrific environment forged the psychological mask he would wear for the rest of his life. The young, soft, classically educated aristocrat from the elite parlors of Virginia had to earn to survive in squalid, disease-ridden military camps. He faced paralyzing winters, severely inadequate supply lines, and constant grinding psychological tension. He learned how to command men who were much rougher, much poorer, and vastly more hardened than he was. To lead them, he had to hide his background. He learned quickly that on the blood-soaked frontier, your aristocratic pedigree meant absolutely nothing. Your physical endurance, your ability to withstand pain, and your projection of unyielding strength meant everything. He began to carefully, deliberately cultivate the persona of the tough, unyielding soldier. He actively suppressed the Virginia gentleman and gave birth to the frontier commander. He participated in the brutal Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, serving as an aide-de-camp to the legendary General Mad Anthony Wayne. He watched Wayne command with iron discipline, tactical brilliance, and ruthless efficiency. Harrison absorbed every single lesson. He saw precisely how a bloody military victory could instantly be minted into golden political capital back in Washington. He understood, with cynical clarity, that the voting public did not care about the nuance of border treaties or the complex, often unethical realities of frontier logistics. They cared about winners. They cared about strongmen. In late 1841, taking advantage of Tecumseh's temporary absence, Harrison marched an army of roughly 1,000 men toward the Confederacy's capital, Prophetstown. He wanted to force a confrontation. He wanted to break the Native American alliance, and more importantly, he wanted to secure a military triumph that would make his name ring out in the halls of Washington. But the reality of what happened next is far removed from the glorious painting of a conquering hero. On the freezing, pitch-black morning of November 7th, 1811, at 4:15 in the morning, Harrison's encampment near the Tippecanoe River was suddenly and violently ambushed. Squatawa, Tecumseh's brother known as the Prophet, launched a desperate surprise attack. The scene was absolute, terrifying chaos. The campfires, which Harrison's men had built up against the cold, perfectly silhouetted the American soldiers, turning them into easy targets in the dark. Harrison was asleep in his tent. He was completely caught off guard. He scrambled into the freezing mud, desperately trying to mount his horse. In the confusion of the dark, he could not find his own signature gray mare and had to ride a dark horse instead. This trivial logistical error is the only reason he survived the morning. The Native American warriors had specifically targeted the man on the gray horse, successfully killing the officer who had mistakenly mounted it. The Battle of Tippecanoe was a brutal, disorganized, and highly costly bloodbath. Harrison's forces suffered heavy casualties. They held their ground, and the Native American warriors eventually withdrew because they ran out of ammunition, not because they were brilliantly outmaneuvered. Prophetstown was burned to the ground the next day, but tactically, the battle was barely a survival, let alone a masterclass in military strategy. Harrison's army limped back to Vincennes, battered, starving, and terrified of a counterattack. But this is where we see Harrison's true genius for manipulation, the very exercise of power that defines our evaluation rubric. Harrison immediately recognized that the messy, terrifying reality of the battle did not matter. The only thing that mattered was who wrote the dispatch to Washington first. Before the mud had even dried on his boots, Harrison fired off letters to the Secretary of War and the Eastern newspapers. He aggressively framed the chaotic, near disastrous ambush as a glorious, decisive triumph of American military might over savagery. He deliberately inflated enemy casualties and downplayed his own tactical blunders. He branded himself the hero of Tippecanoe. The press hung rye for a victory narrative in an era of rising international tensions, swallowed the story whole. The myth of old Tippecanoe was officially born. The public perceived him as a brilliant tactical mastermind who had crushed the Native American threat, completely unaware of the terrifying reality that he had nearly been slaughtered in his sleep due to his own poor camp placement. This fabricated glory carried him through the War of 1812. He was given command of the Army of the Northwest. He won the Battle of the Thames in 1813, a significant victory where Tecumseh was actually killed, effectively ending the Native American Confederacy in the region. Harrison reached the absolute peak of his military career. He was a national hero. But military peaks are incredibly dangerous for ambitious men. When the war ended, Harrison resigned his commission. He returned to civilian life, expecting the nation to lay a path of roses to the highest political offices. Instead, he walked into a multi-decade wilderness of irrelevance, debt, and crushing humiliation. Following his military peak, Harrison walked into a multi-decade wilderness of irrelevance and crushing debt. By the 1830s, the former Supreme Commander of the Northwest was reduced to filing local property deeds as a menial county court clerk. This humiliating fall from grace for a proud Virginia aristocrat created a desperate psychological void, leaving him primed for the ultimate political reinvention. By the late 1830s, the American political landscape was undergoing a massive seismic shift. The newly formed Whig Party was desperate to unseat the incumbent Democrats, specifically Martin Van Buren, who was deeply unpopular due to a crippling economic depression known as the Panic of 1837. The Whig Party bosses, ruthless, brilliant political operators like Thurlow Weed of New York and the incredibly wealthy banker Nicholas Biddle, realized that running on actual political platforms and complex economic policies was a losing strategy. The voting base had expanded. They no longer needed to appeal just to wealthy landowners. They needed to appeal to the masses. They needed a populist. They needed a blank slate. They looked at their most qualified candidate, Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay was brilliant, experienced, and a master legislator. But he had a long, highly controversial voting record. He had enemies. He was too elite. So the Whig bosses deliberately sidelined the architect of their own party. They scoured the landscape for a figurehead who had massive name recognition, but zero recent political baggage. They found the 66-year-old county clerk in Ohio. They dusted off the myth of old Tippecanoe. William Henry Harrison was selected as the Whig nominee for the presidency in 1840, not because of his political brilliance, but specifically because of his political emptiness. The party bosses explicitly ordered him to keep his mouth shut. Nicholas Biddle, the powerful banking magnate orchestrating the campaign's finances, wrote a chilling directive to the campaign managers. Let him say not one single word about his principles or his creed. Let him say nothing, promise nothing. Let no committee, no convention, no town meeting ever extract from him a single word about what he thinks now or what he will do hereafter. Harrison, a man who prided himself on his intellect and his classical education, agreed to this humiliating gag order. The thirst for the ultimate power, the desperation to erase the shame of his county clerk years, overrode his own dignity. He surrendered his agency to the political machine. Then came the moment that changed American political history forever. A Democratic newspaper, the Baltimore Republican, attempted to mock Harrison's age and perceived irrelevance. They published a fatal sneering insult. Give him a barrel of hard cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him, and he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin. It was and to be a devastating aristocratic put-down. Instead, the Whig Party strategists caught it out of the air and weaponized it with terrifying efficiency. They did not deny the insult. They embraced it. They completely inverted reality. They took William Henry Harrison, the son of a founding father, the man born on a sprawling slave plantation, the man with a massive classical library who preferred fine French wines, and completely repackaged him as a poor, dirt-farming, cider-drinking frontiersman. They launched the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign. It was the first modern political campaign in human history, built entirely on aggressive, calculated emotional manipulation rather than policy. The Whigs flooded the country with propaganda. They built massive temporary log cabins in the center of major cities like New York and Philadelphia to serve as campaign headquarters. They held massive alcohol-fueled rallies that drew tens of thousands of people handing out free, cheap hard cider to the working-class voters. They sold an unprecedented amount of campaign merchandise. A Philadelphia distiller named E.C. Booze produced whiskey in bottles shaped exactly like log cabins to support the campaign, a marketing stunt so incredibly successful that the very word booze entered the American lexicon as a synonym for liquor. They created campaign songs, endless slogans, and massive paper balls covered in Whig mottos that supporters physically rolled from town to town, originating the phrase, "Keep the ball rolling." The American public, suffering through a severe economic depression, became completely hypnotized by the spectacle. They wanted a savior who understood their pain. They looked at the propaganda and believed that Harrison was one of them. But behind the roaring crowds and the endless barrels of cider, the physical and psychological reality for Harrison was a living nightmare. He was 67 years old when the campaign started. His health was already declining. His joints ached. His digestion was poor. Yet, he was forced by his handlers to travel extensively, standing on stumps and carriage roofs, delivering carefully scripted empty platitudes to massive crowds. He was forced to constantly drink cheap, highly acidic hard cider in public, a beverage that severely aggravated his already delicate stomach, simply to maintain the illusion of the common man. Every time he raised a tin cup of cider to a cheering crowd, he was drinking a lie. He was an actor trapped in a role he could never, ever break. The psychological burden of this massive fabrication was immense. Harrison knew he was deceiving the nation. He knew he was a patrician masquerading as a plebeian. He lived in constant terror that the mask would slip, that his aristocratic habits would show, or that his physical frailty would be exposed to the ruthless press. This profound, grinding anxiety became his constant companion. He could never relax. He could never show fatigue. He had to be old Tippecanoe 24 hours a day. This unrelenting pressure to perform physical vitality became the engine of his doom. By the time he won the election in an absolute electoral landslide in November 1840, he was a deeply exhausted, physically depleted man. He had sold his soul to the Whig machine to secure the presidency, and the machine had extracted a terrifying physical toll. He had achieved his ultimate dream. He had proven to his detractors, to Andrew Jackson, and to the ghosts of his aristocratic ancestors that he was a man of supreme consequence. In February 1841, William Henry Harrison boarded a train in Ohio to make the long, grueling journey to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. He left his wife, Anna, behind because she was too ill to travel. He traveled alone into the belly of the beast. The contradiction was fully realized. He was about to become the oldest president in the history of the Republic, playing the role of the youngest, toughest, most resilient actor in the American political theater. The public expected the invincible frontiersman. The Whig Party bosses expected a quiet, compliant puppet who would let them run the country. But Harrison, having finally secured the ultimate prize, suddenly decided he was not going to be a puppet. He was determined to prove that he was not just a campaign slogan. He was going to assert his executive authority. He was going to prove his intellectual brilliance. And most fatally of all, he was going to prove to everyone looking at him that he was physically unbreakable. The stage is now perfectly set for the deadliest piece of political theater in American history. The morning of March 4th, 1841, broke over Washington City with a vicious, biting cruelty. The sky was the color of bruised iron. A brutal, freezing wind whipped off the Potomac River, carrying with it a miserable mixture of sleet, snow, and freezing rain that turned the unpaved dirt avenues of the capital into freezing, treacherous sloughs of mud. It was the absolute worst possible weather for a 68-year-old man to stand outside. But William Henry Harrison was not just a 68-year-old man. He was a captive to his own mythology. Before he even stepped out the door of his hotel, a brutal political power struggle had already taken place behind closed doors. The Whig Party bosses, who had cynically engineered his rise to the presidency, firmly believed that Harrison was merely a figurehead. The brilliant, domineering Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky and the towering intellectual Daniel Webster of Massachusetts fully intended to run the country from the legislative branch. They viewed Harrison as a convenient, malleable instrument. To cement this dynamic, Daniel Webster had taken it upon himself to heavily edit Harrison's inaugural address. Webster, a master orator, spent hours crossing out Harrison's extensive, ponderous references to ancient Roman history. Webster famously boasted to his landlady that he had spent the evening killing 17 Roman proconsuls as dead as smelts. But the Whig bosses had profoundly miscalculated the psychological state of their candidate. Harrison had spent the last decade of his life enduring the humiliating, soul-crushing drudgery of a county clerk. He had spent the entire campaign season being physically paraded around the country like a trained circus animal, forced to drink cheap cider and smile while men with half his pedigree made the real decisions. He had swallowed his immense aristocratic pride for the sake of the victory. But now the victory was secured. He was the president-elect. The time for submission was over when Webster handed him the aggressively edited speech. Harrison bristled. The psychological wound inflicted by years of being underestimated suddenly tore open. He rejected Webster's edits. He meticulously added the Roman proconsuls back into the text. He was absolutely determined to prove to Henry Clay, to Daniel Webster, and to the entire intellectual elite of Washington that he was not a simpleton from a log cabin. He was a classically educated Virginia gentleman, and he was going to force the American public to listen to his intellect. This desperate need for intellectual validation was matched only by his desperate need for physical validation. As he prepared to leave for the capital, his aides brought him a heavy winter overcoat. They brought him thick gloves. They brought him a warm hat. Harrison looked at the winter clothing. He looked out the window at the freezing sleet, and he categorically refused all of it. This is the exact moment the historical lie begins. Generations of historians have framed this refusal as an act of stupid, reckless vanity. But if you look at it through the lens of Harrison's fatal weakness, his absolute terror of appearing frail, the decision makes perfect, tragic sense. If he wore the heavy coat, he would look like exactly what his political enemies claimed he was, a weak furs, easing, decrepit old man who had no business holding the highest office in the land. His entire campaign had been built on the premise of his rugged, unbreakable frontier stamina. He had a psychological mandate to visually perform that stamina for the tens of thousands of people gathering in the freezing mud. He chose the physical manifestation of his psychological state. He chose to freeze rather than look weak. He mounted a brilliant white charger, refusing the comfort of a closed carriage. He rode proudly down Pennsylvania Avenue, completely exposed to the elements, flanked by military escorts and wildly cheering crowds who were bundled in thick wool and furs. When he arrived at the east portico of the United States Capitol, he dismounted, walked up the steps, and stood before the nation. He unrolled his manuscript. The wind immediately began violently tearing at the pages. The freezing rain plastered his thin suit to his body, and then he began to read. William Henry Harrison delivered an inaugural address consisting of 8,445 words. It remains to this day the longest inaugural address in the history of the United States. He stood at the podium, shivering violently, his voice cracking against the wind, for nearly 2 excruciating hours. The content of the speech was a masterpiece of political contradiction, highlighting the massive gap between what he intended and what he had actually done in his life. For 2 hours, freezing to the bone, Harrison lectured the shivering crowd on the grave dangers of excessive executive power. He explicitly promised to be a weak president. He promised to defer to Congress. He promised to serve only one single term. He spent massive portions of the speech drawing elaborate allegories to Julius Caesar, ancient Greece, and the Roman Republic, warning against the tyranny of military commanders who seized civilian authority. The hypocrisy was staggering. The viewers, if they were politically astute, must have been bewildered. Here was a man who, for 12 years as the governor of the Indiana Territory, had ruled as a virtual autocrat. He had commanded troops, negotiated treaties through intimidation, and possessed more unchecked dictatorial power than almost any American executive before him. Yet here he was standing in the sleet, denouncing the very executive dominance he had built his entire career upon. But the crowd was not analyzing his political contradictions. They were simply trying to survive the cold. They watched in a state of stunned, freezing endurance as the old man stubbornly refused to stop talking. Finally, the ordeal ended. He took the oath of office administered by Chief Justice Roger Taney. The crowd dispersed, desperate for warmth. Harrison mounted his white horse again, still refusing a coat, and rode back down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. According to the neatly packaged historical narrative, this is the moment Harrison signed his own death warrant. The history books tell us that the cold immediately seeped into his lungs. The pneumonia instantly took hold, and the stubborn old man was doomed from the moment he stepped off the podium. But the timeline shatters the lie. The daily logs, private letters, and newspaper reports reveal a highly inconvenient truth. For 22 days following the freezing inauguration, Harrison remained completely healthy. On the evening of March 4th, he attended 3 separate inaugural balls. He danced, he socialized, he stayed out late into the night projecting the exact same robust, unbreakable energy he had displayed on the Capitol steps. For the next 3 weeks, his health was perfectly fine. He exhibited absolutely no signs of respiratory distress. The human immune system is complex, but it does not pause an acute bacterial pneumonia infection for 22 days, only to suddenly activate it. The cold weather was a massive physical stressor, but it was not the killer. The real killer was waiting inside the White House, and the mechanism of delivery was about to be accelerated by the brutal reality of 19th century American politics. Up to this point, Harrison had survived the weather. Now, he had to survive the spoil system. When Harrison took office, the Whig Party had been locked out of the White House for 12 long, agonizing years. They were starving for federal patronage. In 1841, there was no civil service protection. When a new administration took over, every single federal job, from high-ranking cabinet secretaries down to local postmasters, customs inspectors, and lighthouse keepers, was abruptly fired and replaced with loyal supporters of the winning party. And in 1841, the White House was essentially an open public building. There was no Secret Service perimeter. There were no background checks. Any citizen could simply walk through the front doors, demand an audience with the President of the United States, and hand him a piece of paper begging for a job. Starting on the morning of March 5th, the White House was placed under absolute siege. Thousands of desperate, aggressive, relentless men descended upon the executive mansion. They packed the hallways. They filled the waiting rooms. They cornered Harrison in the corridors, on the staircases, and even interrupted him while he was trying to eat his meals. They shoved letters of recommendation into his face. They demanded post office appointments in Ohio, customs jobs in New York, and clerkships in Washington. The physical and psychological toll of this relentless daily mob was catastrophic. Harrison, already exhausted from the campaign and the inauguration, was suddenly working 18-hour days. He was forced to constantly navigate vicious political infighting among his own cabinet members, specifically dealing with the towering ego of Henry Clay, who repeatedly stormed into the White House, demanding that Harrison appoint Clay's personal allies to key positions. Harrison's psychological weakness, his desperate need to project control, forced him to try and handle the crushing workload himself. He refused to delegate. He personally interviewed hundreds of applicants. He personally reviewed minor administrative appointments. He was drowning in the sheer suffocating bureaucracy of the federal government. He was getting virtually no sleep. His stress levels were completely maximized. And as he sat at his desk in the Oval Office, surrounded by shouting men, exhausted, sweating, and speaking for hours on end, William Henry Harrison experienced a very natural biological response. He became incredibly thirsty. To soothe his dry throat, to keep himself awake and functioning through the endless onslaught of office seekers, Harrison constantly drank water. He did not drink wine or alcohol during the day. He drank the fresh, cool, supposedly pure water piped directly into the White House from the nearby Franklin Square Springs. Every single time he lifted that crystal glass to his lips between March 5th and March 25th, he was bypassing the freezing weather outside and directly introducing a microscopic assassin into his gastrointestinal tract. We must look at the exact biological process that was occurring silently inside the president's body during those 3 weeks. This is the crucial evidence that the historical narrative deliberately ignores. When a human being ingests water contaminated with Salmonella typhi, the bacteria responsible for enteric fever, commonly known as typhoid fever, The disease does not strike immediately. It is not like a cold. It requires a highly specific, insidious incubation period. The bacteria survive the acidic environment of the stomach and enter the small intestine. They penetrate the intestinal mucosa and are taken up by the macrophages, the very immune cells designed to destroy them. But Salmonella typhi is brilliant. It survives inside the macrophages. It uses the host's own immune system as a transport vehicle. Over the course of roughly 7 to 21 days, the bacteria silently multiply within the macrophages. They travel through the lymphatic system. They infiltrate the liver, the spleen, and the bone marrow. The patient feels absolutely nothing during this massive internal colonization. They go about their daily lives, attending balls, arguing with senators, and running the country, completely unaware that a biological time bomb is ticking inside their organs. Only when the bacterial load reaches a critical, overwhelming threshold does the bacteria spill back into the bloodstream in massive numbers, triggering a catastrophic systemic inflammatory response. Now overlay this strict biological timeline onto the historical timeline of William Henry Harrison. He moved into the White House and began drinking the contaminated water on March 4th. He spent the next 3 weeks under extreme physical and psychological stress, which severely compromised his baseline immune function, allowing the bacteria to replicate with terrifying speed. For 22 days, he was fine. The pneumonia from the cold theory requires a man to stand in the freezing rain, catch a respiratory infection, show no symptoms for 3 weeks, and then suddenly collapse. From a clinical perspective, this is biological nonsense. But the enteric fever theory fits the timeline with devastating, flawless precision. The 3-week gap is not a mystery. It is the exact incubation period required for the night soil of Washington, D.C. to systematically conquer the president's internal organs. The illusion of his invincible health held perfectly until the final week of March. He had successfully fought off the political maneuvering of Daniel Webster. He had successfully stood down the arrogance of Henry Clay, famously handing Clay a letter telling him to stop treating the president like a child. He had survived the freezing sleet. He had survived the crushing mob of office seekers. He had proven his point, K. He was the unquestioned executive of the United States. But on the morning of March 26, 1841, exactly 22 days after he first drank the water piped from the toxic springs below the night soil depot, the bacterial load in his bloodstream finally breached the critical threshold. The president was sitting at his desk. He was preparing to review yet another stack of patronage requests. Suddenly, a profound, crushing wave of fatigue hit him. It was not the normal exhaustion of a long day. It was a deep, systemic failure. He felt a heavy, dull pain in his abdomen. His digestion, which had always been delicate, abruptly stopped functioning. A deep, cold ache settled into his bones. He tried to push through it. His hamartia, his absolute refusal to show weakness, demanded that he ignore the symptoms. He forced himself to continue working. He met with his cabinet. He tried to project the image of the stoic frontier general. But the bacteria did not care about his mythology. The bacteria did not care about his electoral landslide. By the evening of March 26th, the President of the United States could no longer stand. The physical manifestation of the invisible assassin could no longer be hidden. He surrendered to his bed, shivering uncontrollably, his body burning with a sudden spiking fever. The facade was broken. The theater of the inauguration was officially over. The president was critically ill, and the medical establishment of the United States was about to be summoned to his bedside. They were called upon to save him. Instead, armed with the most advanced barbaric medical theories of the 19th century, they were about to subject William Henry Harrison to a week of unspeakable, grotesque torture. And this is where things really get dirty. The moment William Henry Harrison was confined to his bed on the evening of March 26, 1841, the theater of his presidency abruptly ended, and the grotesque reality of his assassination by the state officially began. We must directly answer the word grotesque. When we evaluate the consequences of systemic negligence and the exercise of power, we usually look at battlefields or economic collapses. But the most terrifying exercise of power in 1841 was not wielded by a politician or a general. It was wielded by the medical establishment. I call it grotesque because what happened inside the presidential bedchamber over the next 8 days was not a medical treatment. It was an involuntary, state-sanctioned biological torture session. The issue is not that the doctors failed to cure him. The issue is that their interventions actively, aggressively, and systematically dismantled the president's remaining biological defenses, directly accelerating his death. On March 27th, the frantic White House staff summoned Dr. Thomas Miller. Miller was not a malicious man. He was a highly respected physician in Washington society, but he was a product of his time. He was a practitioner of heroic medicine, the exact same brutal, archaic medical philosophy that Harrison had been so horrified by during his brief stint in medical school 50 years earlier under Benjamin Rush. Heroic medicine operated on a singular, terrifying premise. The human body was essentially a vessel of humors that could become imbalanced. Severe illness required severe, violent intervention to shock the body back into equilibrium. The sicker the patient, the more aggressively they had to be purged, bled, and blistered. When Dr. Miller walked into the dimly lit presidential bedchamber, he found a man in severe distress. Harrison was suffering from a rapidly spiking fever. He had a deep, chilling rigor. He complained of profound exhaustion, severe anxiety, and crippling pain in his abdomen. His digestive system had completely locked up. Dr. Miller examined him. He listened to the president's chest. He palpated the severely distended stomach. He noted congestion in the liver. He noted a slight rattle in the lower right lobe of the LU. Indiges. Now, look at the immense, suffocating political pressure pressing down on Dr. Miller in that exact moment. Outside the bedroom doors, the entire Whig Party apparatus was in a state of absolute blind panic. Daniel Webster and the cabinet members were pacing the halls. The party had spent millions of dollars and compromised all their political principles to install this man in the White House. The fragile coalition they had built to defeat the Democrats was entirely dependent on Harrison staying alive. Furthermore, the United States Constitution at that time was incredibly vague about presidential succession. No president had ever died in office. If Harrison died, the government would plunge into an unprecedented constitutional crisis. Dr. Miller knew he had to deliver a diagnosis to the panicked cabinet and the hungry press corps waiting on the White House lawn. He looked at the myriad of symptoms. The overwhelming clinical presentation was severe gastrointestinal failure, the hallmark of the Salmonella typhi bacteria silently multiplying in Harrison's gut. But explaining an abstract, unidentifiable bowel disease was messy. It sounded undignified. It did not project strength. So Dr. Miller made a calculated, highly political medical decision. He focused on the minor secondary symptom in the chest. He diagnosed the president with pneumonia. We do not have to guess his motives. We have his own written admission. Months later, when defending his catastrophic failure, Dr. Miller explicitly wrote in his medical examiner's report, "The disease was not viewed as a case of pure pneumonia, but as this was the most palpable affection, the term pneumonia afforded a succinct and intelligible answer to the innumerable questions as to the nature of the attack." This line is devastating. It is a smoking gun. The leading physician of the Capitol admitted that pneumonia was a public relations strategy. It was a succinct, intelligible lie designed to manage the narrative. The public understood pneumonia. It was a clean, respectable disease. It fed perfectly into the myth of the stoic general standing in the freezing rain. But inside the bedroom, the treatment plan dictated by this fabricated diagnosis was about to unleash hell on Harrison's already failing organs. Because Miller had publicly anchored himself to the diagnosis of lung congestion and fever, the heroic medical playbook demanded an immediate, violent expulsion of fluids. The first weapon the doctors deployed was calomel. This is where the physical manifestations of the treatment become deeply disturbing. Calomel is mercury chloride. It is a highly toxic heavy metal. In the 19th century, it was the go-to purgative for virtually every severe ailment. The doctors believed it would stimulate the liver and force the bowels to empty, thereby flushing out the disease. Harrison's intestinal mucosa was currently a microscopic war zone. The typhoid bacteria had burrowed deep into the lining of his gut, causing massive inflammation, ulceration, and a complete shutdown of normal peristalsis. His bowels were paralyzed by the infection. Into this agonizing, highly inflamed environment, Dr. Miller introduced massive, repeated doses of mercury. When the heavy doses of calomel hit the human digestive tract, the chemical reaction is catastrophic. The mercury acts as a corrosive poison. It chemically burns the lining of the stomach and the intestines. Instead of curing the patient, it rapidly induces mercury poisoning. The physical symptoms of this poisoning are horrific. It causes the gums to soften, swell, and bleed profusely. It loosens the teeth in the jaw. It triggers massive, uncontrollable salivation. Patients would literally drool pints of thick, metallic-tasting saliva a day. Harrison lay in his bed, his body burning with typhoid fever, desperately needing hydration, while the mercury systematically destroyed his ability to absorb any fluids whatsoever. The calomel stripped away the a protective mucus layer of his intestines, practically guaranteeing that the salmonella bacteria would seep even deeper into his bloodstream. But the medical assault was only just beginning. When the calomel failed to produce the massive bowel movements the doctors desired, because Harrison's typhoid-paralyzed colon simply could not function, Dr. Miller escalated the violence. He introduced a relentless cocktail of chemical irritants. He forced the president to swallow massive doses of castor oil, rhubarb, and ipecac. These substances are aggressive emetics and laxatives. They caused violent, agonizing spasms in the stomach. Harrison was caught in a cycle of severe, agonizing nausea without the physical ability to relieve the pressure in his lower abdomen. To break the stubborn constipation, the medical team subjected the dying president to a relentless barrage of invasive enemas. They repeatedly forced fluids and irritants up into his inflamed rectum. For a man suffering from the severe, ulcerating intestinal lesions characteristic of enteric fever, these aggressive, forceful enemas were excruciating. They caused immense cramping, and carried a massive risk of physically perforating the bowel, a complication that would have caused immediate lethal sepsis. Look at the immense gap between how the public perceived their president and his inner reality. The public outside the White House gates was holding prayer vigils for the rugged hero of Tippecanoe, the man of iron who had conquered the frontier. Inside the bedroom, the most powerful man in the Americas was reduced to a helpless, weeping, violently sick patient, repeatedly subjected to the most humiliating and painful gastrointestinal violations imaginable by men who firmly believed they were saving him. His fatal weakness, his desperate psychological need to project unwavering strength, was weaponized against him by his own doctors. A weaker man might have screamed, a weaker man might have physically fought off the doctors and demanded to be left alone. But Harrison was the general. He had spent his entire adult life suppressing his physical pain to maintain his command. So he endured the torture with gritted teeth. He allowed them to poison him. He allowed them to violate him. He suffered the agony of the mercury and the enemas with a stoic, terrifying silence, believing it was his duty to endure the cure just as he had endured the mud of the battlefield. By March 29th, 3 days into the medical siege, the situation took a darker turn. Harrison's chest began to ache, not from primary pneumonia, but from the systemic failure of his organs and the sheer physical exhaustion of his chemically induced agony. Dr. Miller, seeing the pain in the chest, decided that the internal purging was not enough. He needed to draw the disease out through the skin. He ordered the application of blisters. This practice is the absolute zenith of medical barbarism in this era. The doctors took cantharides, a highly toxic preparation made from the dried, crushed bodies of blister beetles, commonly known as Spanish fly. They mixed this toxic powder into a thick, sticky paste. They spread this paste onto heavy cloth plasters. They then approached the shivering, exhausted president, ripped open his nightshirt, and slapped these toxic plasters directly onto his bare chest and across his severely distended, agonizingly painful abdomen. The physical mechanics of blistering are straightforward and horrifying. The toxic chemicals in the cantharides immediately attack the epidermis. Over the course of several hours, the skin burns. It chemically melts. The body, reacting to the intense localized poison, floods the area with serum, causing the skin to bubble up into massive, excruciatingly painful, fluid-filled blisters. The doctors believed that the fluid filling these blisters was the physical manifestation of the disease being sucked out of the vital organs. Once the blisters were fully formed, weeping, and agonizingly tight, the doctors would often intentionally lance them with an unsterilized scalpel to drain the pus, leaving massive, raw, open chemical burns across the patient's torso. Imagine the reality of William Henry Harrison's existence by April 1st. He had been effectively poisoned with mercury. His intestines were paralyzed and ulcerated by typhoid and chemical laxatives. He was massively, dangerously dehydrated. And now, his entire chest and stomach were covered in raw, weeping, agonizing chemical burns. Every time he tried to breathe, every time he tried to shift his weight in the mattress, the friction of the sheets against his blistered skin sent shock waves of blinding pain through his nervous system. To manage this horrific man-made agony, the doctors introduced the final element of their destructive cocktail, laudanum. Laudanum is a highly potent tincture of opium mixed with alcohol. It is a profound narcotic. They fed it to him to dull the pain of the blisters and the abdominal cramps. But opium is also a powerful paralytic for the gastrointestinal tract. By giving him laudanum, the doctors were actively cementing the severe constipation that they were simultaneously trying to break with mercury and enemas. They were putting the brake and the gas pedal to the floor of a dying engine at the exact same time. The medical regimen was completely, fundamentally contradictory. The psychological toll on Harrison was absolute. The opium clouded his brilliant, classically trained mind. He began to hallucinate. He drifted in and out of a heavy narcotic delirium. The man who had meticulously debated Roman history on the Capitol steps was now trapped in a hazy, agonizing twilight, surrounded by the terrifying shadows of his political handlers. The Whig Party bosses, realizing that their puppet was dying, began to crowd the edges of the room. They were not there to offer comfort. They were there to manage the political fallout. They hovered like vultures, watching the rapid deterioration of their investment. The air in the room was thick with the smell of sweat, the metallic tang of the mercury salivation, the sharp, acidic odor of the mustard plasters, and the heavy, sweet stench of the opium. It was an atmosphere of total, suffocating despair. And then came the midpoint peak of his physical collapse. On April 3rd, the internal dam finally broke. The typhoid bacteria, having multiplied unchecked for weeks, fully breached the intestinal walls. The massive conflicting doses of laxatives, mercury, and enemas finally forced the paralyzed, ruined bowels to evacuate. It was not a relief. It was a catastrophic biological failure. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the severe constipation gave way to massive, violent, profuse diarrhea. Dr. Miller noted in his log that the discharge was incredibly dark and highly foetid. The clinical terminology for the horrific, distinct smell of necrotic intestinal tissue and severe bacterial infection passing out of the body. This was the final fatal blow. The sudden, massive loss of fluid from the diarrhea, combined with the days of forced purging, blistering, and lack of water intake, threw William Henry Harrison's body into profound hypovolemic and septic shock. His vascular system simply collapsed. There was no longer enough blood volume or pressure to keep his vital organs functioning. Look at the vivid visual of his physical state. Dr. Miller stood by the bed and watched the president slip away. He noted that Harrison's pulse became incredibly rapid, weak, and sinking. It felt like a faint, fluttering thread beneath the skin of his wrist. Then, the blood supply to his extremities shut down as his dying heart desperately tried to hoard the remaining oxygen for his brain and lungs. Harrison's hands and feet turned ice cold. The skin beneath his fingernails and toes turned a sickly, bruised purple, the undeniable visual marker of cyanosis. The oxygen was gone. The blood was pooling. The invincible frontier general, the survivor of Tippecanoe, the man who had weathered the freezing sleet of March 4th without flinching, was rapidly turning into a corpse before their very eyes. The doctors backed away from the bed. The heroism of their medicine had run its course. They had bled him. They had blistered him. They had poisoned him. They had subjected him to every violent, primitive weapon in their arsenal. And in doing so, they had perfectly aided the microscopic bacteria from the Washington Night Soil Depot in its mission to execute the commander-in-chief. The room grew deadly silent, save for the ragged, wet sound of Harrison's failing lungs fighting for air. The opium delirium began to lift just enough for the final tragic moments of lucidity. The political machine had demanded his soul. The Capitol's infrastructure had infected his body, and his own doctors had destroyed his defenses. Now, there was nothing left but the ticking of the clock, the terrified stares of his cabinet, and the looming massive shadow of a constitutional crisis that was about to break over the nation like a thunderstorm. He was no longer a president. He was a casualty. The final hours of April 3rd bled into the early pitch-black morning of April 4th, setting the stage for the absolute collapse of the Whig Party's grand design, and cementing a legacy of death that the history books would immediately begin to cover up. The clock in the presidential bedchamber struck 12:30 in the morning on April 4th, 1841. The ragged, shallow breathing that had haunted the room for days finally ceased. The chest of the 68-year-old president stopped rising. William Henry Harrison was dead. In his final moments of opium-laced delirium, he had uttered his last words. In his fevered, dying brain, he bypassed his absent wife and his attending doctors, uttering his final directive to a man who was not even in the room, Vice President John Tyler. Harrison gasped, "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." It is a deeply tragic, almost pathetic final statement. It highlights the ultimate gap between his intentions and his reality. He died believing he was leaving behind a grand political legacy, a roadmap for the Republic. In truth, he was leaving behind a shattered political party, an unprecedented constitutional crisis, and a physical body that had been utterly destroyed by the very capital he sought to govern. The moment Harrison's heart stopped, the physical suffering ended, but the political cover-up immediately began. The Whig Party bosses and the cabinet members standing in that room were not just looking at a dead friend. They were looking at the catastrophic collapse of their entire political strategy. They had spent millions. They had engineered the most elaborate, emotionally manipulative campaign in human history to put this specific man in the Oval Office. And now, after just 31 days, the office was empty. They needed a narrative, and they needed it before the sun came up. Dr. Thomas Miller sat down to write the official medical examiner's report. He was a man staring down the barrel of his own professional ruin. If he admitted the truth that the president had died of a catastrophic gastrointestinal infection exacerbated by massive toxic doses of mercury and chemical burns, the public outrage would have been uncontrollable. It would have exposed the barbaric incompetence of the medical elite. Furthermore, if he admitted that the disease originated from the White House water supply, it would have indicted the federal government for maintaining a filthy, lethal infrastructure. So Dr. Miller codified the lie. He leaned heavily into the pneumonia diagnosis. He officially blamed the cold weather. He blamed the freezing rain of March 4th. He blamed the president's own stubborn refusal to wear a coat. It was a master stroke of narrative manipulation. The public, completely unaware of the existence of microscopic bacteria, readily accepted the story. It made perfect, logical sense to a 19th century mind. The story of the proud, stubborn old general freezing to death because of his own vanity was an incredibly compelling moral fable. It absolved Dr. Miller. It absolved the Whig Party. Most importantly, it completely absolved the deadly failing infrastructure of Washington, D.C. The history books swallowed the pneumonia myth whole, and they have regurgitated it for nearly 2 centuries. But the most terrifying consequence of this cover-up was that the real killer remained completely undetected. Because Harrison's death was officially blamed on the weather, absolutely no one investigated the White House plumbing. The iron pipes connected to the Franklin Square Springs were left exactly as they were. The Knight Soil Depot at 15th and R Street continued to operate. Every single night, horse-drawn carts continued to dump massive mounds of human feces into the marshland. Every single time it rained, that toxic waste continued to seep into the groundwater, flowing downhill straight into the drinking water of the executive mansion. The White House was not just a political residence, it was an active, functioning death trap. And because of the pneumonia cover-up, the trap remained set. Look at the terrifying, undeniable pattern that followed. 4 years later, James K. Polk moved into the White House. He drank from the exact same water supply. During his presidency, Polk suffered from horrific, agonizing bouts of severe gastroenteritis. His digestive system was completely ruined. He survived his single term, but the relentless intestinal infections left his body so permanently ravaged and weakened that he died of cholera just 3 months after leaving office. Then in 1850, Zachary Taylor became president. He was another hardened military general. On a blistering, hot 4th of July, Taylor attended a ceremony at the Washington G-Tone Monument. He returned to the White House sweating and exhausted. To cool down, he consumed a large bowl